England's oldest national flag, the St. George flag, red cross on white banner, is currently embroiled in controversy, particularly in the context of that nation's migrant crisis. The more some Brits raise it aloft, the more others complain. Those waving it say they are simply showing pride in being English, reclaiming a symbol that represents national unity, heritage, and patriotism, no different from when other peoples of other nations fly their flags. Their detractors, however, most of whom are inherently anti-English, even if they have English DNA, claim that the flag is representative of far-right racist and xenophobic tendencies, that it symbolizes exclusion or hostility for migrants, the overwhelming majority of whom are Muslim. The truth appears to be somewhere in the middle. English patriots are indeed turning to their nation's oldest flag as a collective show of patriotic defiance against what they see as an Islamic migrant takeover, where Muslims are used to destroy their nation, groom their women, and suppress English, specifically Christian culture and heritage. Meanwhile, the greater irony is that both groups fail to realize that in its origin, the St. George flag was born precisely in the context of Christian defenders fighting against Islamic aggressors. Here, we must turn to that forgotten, that is intentionally suppressed and/or distorted discipline of history. The St. George flag originated in the Middle Ages as a military and religious emblem inseparable from the Crusades. The Knights of the Temple, or Templars, who were founded in the early 12th century, were the first to adopt it. As chaste monks, white symbolized their purity. And as men committed to fighting Muslims to the death in defense of Christendom, the red cross symbolized their willingness to embrace martyrdom, which a great many of them did over the course of nearly 2 centuries. In the years following the Templars' adoption of the red cross on white, that emblem became popular for other crusaders, and for the very same reason. It also came to be associated with St. George, a 3rd, 4th century Christian soldier who was martyred by the pagan Roman Empire for refusing to renounce Christ. In the medieval era, he naturally became a symbolic figure representing Christian militancy and the willingness to be martyred for Christ in the fight against Islam. Indeed, from the very start, St. George was consistently portrayed as a celestial knight who literally fought beside the Crusaders. Of the Crusader storming of Muslim-held Jerusalem in 1099, Raymond of Aguilera, a participant and eyewitness of the First Crusade, wrote that, quote, "The blessed George was seen in the army of Christ, fighting against the Saracens and giving victory to the faithful." Nearly a century later, during the Third Crusade, around 1190, the English king, Richard I, the Lionheart, regularly invoked George as his patron saint. His men also believed that the warrior saint fought alongside them. In the words of another contemporary chronicler, quote, "St. George, the standard-bearer of the heavenly army, came to the aid of the Christians and overthrew the enemies of the cross." Nearly a century after that, during the Ninth Crusade, around 1270, Prince Edward, who would later become King of England, was especially devoted to and, quote, "commended himself and his men to the most blessed martyr George, whom he had ever taken as his special patron in war," to quote from another contemporary source. On returning to and becoming King of England, Edward I continued to officially endorse and use St. George as a symbol of chivalry, military courage, and martyrdom against anti-Christian forces. So did his descendants, especially his grandson, Edward III. And before long, certainly no later than the mid-1300s, St. George and his banner, blood red cross on white, became central to English identity and represented the militant protection of Christian England against external threats, with Muslims as the paragons. For centuries thereafter, the warrior saint's flag inspired courage, chivalry, and a distinctly English sense of martial and religious identity. Because the blood red cross on white flag originated with the Templars, who formed the subject of my latest book, The Two Swords of Christ, we close with an anecdote concerning those original Knights of Christ and how even Muslims were aware of and feared St. George. In 1187, a vastly outnumbered group of some 500 Crusaders, led by the Templars, were ambushed by a massive Muslim army of some 7,000 fighters near Nazareth. Although the Crusaders, and especially the Templars, made a valiant stand, they were all hewn down, until only one Templar knight was left standing. He scorned the offer of surrender and continued fighting, forming a ring of dead jihadists around him, to the point that the awed Muslims were convinced he was St. George. In the words of the author of the contemporary Itinerarium Peregrinorum, quote, "While the rest of his fellow knights, estimated to number 500, had either been captured or killed, he bore all the force of the battle alone, and shone out as a glorious champion for the law of his God. He was surrounded by enemy troops and almost abandoned by human aid. But when he saw so many thousands running towards him from all directions, he strengthened his resolve and courageously undertook the battle, one man against all. His commendable courage won him his enemies' approval. Many were sorry for him and affectionately urged him to surrender, but he ignored their urgings, for he was not afraid to die for Christ. At long last, crushed rather than conquered by spears, stones, and lances, he sank to the ground and joyfully passed to heaven with a martyr's crown, triumphant. It was indeed a gentle death, with no place for sorrow, when one man's sword had constructed such a great crown for himself from the enemy crowd laid all around him. Death is sweet when the victor lies encircled by the impious people he has slain with his victorious right hand. And because it so happened that the warrior had been riding a white horse and had white armor and weapons, the Gentiles, meaning the Muslims, who knew that St. George had this appearance in battle, boasted that they had killed the knight of shining armor, the protector of the Christians. Such is the true origin of England's St. George flag. It was forged in centuries of warfare against and martyrdom at the hands of Muslims. Incidentally, that a Christian saint is tied to a European nation's long war against Islam, in this case England's, should be unsurprising. The need for warrior saints was rather ubiquitous across Christendom. One need only look to Spain's patron saint, St. James Matamoros, that is, St. James the Moor, meaning Muslim, slayer. Check out my video on him and how he inspired and, according to the Spaniards of history, spearheaded the centuries-long crusade or Reconquista to evict Islam out of Spain. At any rate, the point here is that the St. George flag is much more applicable to England's Muslim migrant crisis than most English men and women waving it can even begin to comprehend. Put differently, the St. George flag is a stark reminder that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.